Good morning, everyone. My name's Professor Julie Willis. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning here at the University of Melbourne. I'd like to begin by thanking Wurundjeri Elder Perry Wandin for a really fabulous welcome ceremony. I'd also like to pay respects to the traditional owners of the unceded lands in which we gather today, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples here today with us, and to acknowledge very importantly the role of Indigenous knowledges in the Academy. Thank you all for joining us here today. It's a real pleasure to welcome you here to day 2 of the 2025 Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning Symposium, Designing Learning Spaces for Neurodiversity. This year's theme asks the question, what if learning spaces were designed for everyone? That question is one that invites us to pause, reflect and reimagine. What if every classroom, every corridor, every corner of our learning environments welcomed difference, not just something to accommodate, but as something to celebrate? Today, we're really fortunate to hear from many leading voices, including our keynote speakers, Professor Magda Mostafa, a global pioneer in autism and neuro-inclusive design, and Dr. Jody Wilson, whose lived experience, research and advocacy work has seen her challenge assumptions and disrupt the status quo. Their insights, along with the rich program of panels and workshops featuring educators, designers, researchers and people with lived experience, will help us rethink how we design spaces that truly support every learner. I'd like to congratulate the organisers of today's symposium for bringing this event to life, including Associate Professor Ben Cleveland, whose leadership and dedication has been instrumental in convening this important gathering. My sincere thanks to Ben and the entire organising team, including Liz Gay, Sarah Backhouse, and event manager Rosanna Verde. You've really created something very special here. Throughout the day, I encourage you to all share your knowledge, ask questions, connect with one another, and enjoy the conversations and experiences that make this symposium possible. This is a space to learn from one another, build connections, and enjoy being part of a community that's imagining a much more inclusive future. And with that, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Ben for today's overview. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Julie. And look, we really appreciate the faculty support. As Julie said, this is the ABP Symposium. This is an annual event with a very different theme every year. In past years, we've had themes about Indigenous design, about retrofitting buildings for low carbon futures and so on. And so it's a great opportunity to sort of bring topical issues together and bring a group of people together who've got a great interest in those particular topics. I think it's welcome to many of you today. It's also welcome back to those of you who were able to join us yesterday in a smaller venue and a more intimate experience. Today we'll be addressing, as Julie said, a whole range of issues to do with inclusion in our early years environments, in our schools, in our higher education and TAFE environments. And I think we all share a great interest in a better future in those settings. Yesterday we had an absolutely wonderful opening keynote from Dr. Beth McAnally from the Queensland State Government. We had parallel sessions from 29 different presentation groups, sharing very short 10-minute presentations of the research or the lived experience or the practice that they've been engaged in over the last few years. And we had some really rich discussions. Today is a bigger forum. It's still, however, an opportunity for engaging in a really rich discussion that is multidisciplinary. And I think the thing that's really very encouraging for us is that we've got people from the built environment design disciplines, we've got people from education, we've got people from health, we've got people from the disability support, and we've got people with lived experience here as well. And I think what we hope will happen, and I believe will happen as it did yesterday, is that we'll be sharing a whole range of perspectives that will help us all learn something new and leave today with new trajectories and new sense of sort of being emboldened to make our future better. So I think I probably better not say too much at this point because we've got a very rich program. We've got a lot of people contributing through the keynotes and through the panels, and also through our facilitated discussions, which will happen around the middle of the day, where each of you will have a chance to share your thoughts as well as listen to the thoughts of those people we've invited to contribute in a more formal way. So what I might do is move to the housekeeping, which is of course very important. I'll quickly point out that we've got, for today, we're hoping to engage in a lot of to and fro Q&A through the ends of the discussions. We're going to be doing that in two ways. One is we'll have roving microphones, and so if you feel that you would like to ask a question in person, the ability to do that will be to put your hand up, and one of our, Simon or Carolina, will be roving with the microphones. You're welcome to ask questions in person. I'd encourage you to do so. But also, we'll be using this well, I see lots of phones coming up. We'll be using Slido, so you can type your question into the app and it will appear up on the big screen, so you can share that with everyone, and we'll try and engage in those questions as well. So there's options for everyone to try and share their thoughts and particularly their questions. In terms of other housekeeping matters, there are quite a few, so bear with me. Mobile phones, please turn them to silent. Bathrooms out in the foyer, there's both accessible and other bathrooms at the far end of the room over here. Lunch and afternoon tea will be served. Both will be served out here in the foyer. However, that will become a very busy space, and so we encourage you to go up to level 1. So past the ground floor, up to level 1 into the atrium. There'll be seating and space there to enjoy lunch. And also throughout the rest of the building, there are lots of seating options which you are welcome to occupy as you see fit, including the level 4 staff lounge, which you're welcome to use as well. And in trying to keep the event as inclusive as possible, we've also arranged for a quiet or sensory room up on level 4. And for those of you who've been in the building before, we've transformed the Japanese room with the very kind support of Modern Teaching Aids, who also supplied the quiet room furnishings for yesterday's event in our alternative venue. So please go and have a look. If not, stay and pause and find a little bit of respite up in the Japanese room on level 4 when you feel the need. But the whole building is available for your use throughout the day to meet your needs. There is Wi-Fi, username and password available there if needed. I've talked about the Q&A. I've talked about Simon and Carolina with the microphones as we get into that part of the day. So let's get on with our program. If I can invite Judy, Kate, Hayley, Audrey and Matt, if you wouldn't mind joining us up the front, and we'll get started on our first panel. So just bear with us just for a moment.
All right. So look, as I've been saying, look, we've got a really multidisciplinary group here today. One of our great intentions is to hear from people who are not necessarily architects. In fact, we have no architects on our first panel. We will, however, at the end, we'll invite Magna Mustafa, who of course is our closing keynote at the end of the day, to join us to try and share some reflections from an architectural perspective. But we really wanted to start the day with thinking about the user and practice perspective on inclusion and our educational environments. And so we've invited a panel who I'll introduce very briefly. We've got Audrey Anderson, who of course is here speaking from her own lived experience. We've got Hayley Barber, who is a consultant with the Heads Together for Acquired Brain Injury organisation, who is also headed by Kate Hine, who is the founder and the director of Heads Together for Acquired Brain Injury. Matthew Harrison, who many of you met yesterday, sitting on one of our panels, Associate Professor in Learning Intervention in our School of Education here. And sitting at the far end, we've got Judy Connell, who's the Manager for Disability Inclusion for Victorian Catholic Education Authority. And we've enjoyed quite a long journey, Judy and I, on some research over the years. So the idea of the panel is that we're going to give them each sort of 3 to 5 minutes to share their thoughts on the question of diverse perspectives on physical learning environments, what needs to change. what we've intended through the day is at the arc of the day, we're trying to problematise these issues through these early panels. And as the day goes on, discuss more of the known solutions and the things that we need to know more about. So this panel today is really about identifying where the challenges lie and what might we do about them. Will carry on through the rest of the day. So I'll quickly check my notes, just bear with me.
While Ben is checking his notes, I would like to point out I'm not an architect, but I have built the Lego Home Alone house. Does that count?
I think it's a start, Nat. I think it's a start. So look, we're going to make a start with Kate. And Kate, we've talked about, just sharing a little bit about the perspective from which you're speaking. And you were particularly going to talk about, what accessibility means for students and staff in our educational settings. So over to you. Thanks, Kate.
Is that working? Oh, yeah. I did never think that I'd be speaking at a symposium for architects. So in honour of that, I've worn my funky glasses. So I'm Kate Honey, as Ben said, founder of Heads Together for Brain Injury. So we're a Victorian non-profit who've been connecting and supporting young people with brain injuries and their families since 2003. And our organisation is really about bringing together people with professional and lived experience of brain injury to co-design and run peer-based programs. And I just wanted to give you that background because that's really what I'm here to represent today. So, when I started Heads Together 23 years ago, I was practicing as a kids physio, specialising in brain injury rehab. And I kind of had a realisation that maybe as a single 29-year-old with no children and no lived experience of trauma or disability, that maybe what families really needed was a non-clinical space to build connections with people who shared their experience, people who got it and could support them through the rehab process. And everything that follows, I think living with brain injury, as you're going to hear, is a really complex, lifelong and ever-evolving condition. And I think, it's really important to build a new brain injury family that isn't going to be at the whim of whoever decides how long your rehab should last or how much funding you might have. And so why I bring this up, as I said, is that I've really had the privilege of learning from lived experience for a long time. And that's why I'm so passionate now about co-design research and pushing for people with lived experience to be embedded in all aspects of design, delivery, and systemic advocacy. So I think one of the phrases that I love about inclusion is that there's nothing about me without me, and I really think that that should be the cornerstone of all inclusion practice. But I think still too often young people and families are being presented with solutions without being consulted about what they actually want or need. So I think, running Heads Together's really informed my practice as a clinician, but it's also helped me reflect that I've been guilty many times of making assumptions about what my clients need rather than working collaboratively. And I think that really, truly equitable inclusion, it can be really challenging, can be really time-consuming and sometimes even confronting. But I think that's why being part of this project is so important. And it's been such a great experience to bring all these different expertise into the room. So I think if there was only one thing I could say about inclusive design, it would be to always include the ideas, opinions and feedback from people who are actually using the spaces, and not just as additional data, but as integral parts of the team and the design process all the way from inception to translation. I think I really believe that young people with brain injuries and their families are such an incredible source of advice and expertise, because the nature of brain injury is so multifaceted and it can impact all areas of life, from mobility to communication, sensory processing, cognitive ability, and mental health. And so people with lived experience in this area can offer insights into so many different parts of designing a learning environment. So I realised that I didn't talk about accessibility because this is what I prepared, but I think I can definitely bring that to the conversation as we follow.
We've got lots of time to come back for Q&A as well.
Excellent.
I think you've got a great way to talking to Hayley. Now, Hayley, you wanted to talk a little bit more about, well, your own experience, but also the advocacy, the self-advocacy, and also listening to young people.
You're probably wondering, my professional background in disability is disability support, working with young adults who experience mental health challenges and those with living with brain injury. Most recently, I've been involved with Heads Together and the Stroke Foundation, but you're probably wondering why I'm here today speaking to you about inclusive learning spaces. Halfway through my first year of school, 15th of August 1999, I had just turned 6 in a young family of 6 with 4 kids under 8. My new teacher said I was really smart when I had a stroke. The stroke left its profound impacts that are still felt today. It made it difficult for me to navigate the physical learning environment due to hemiplegia, one-sided weakness. That significantly reduced my function in my right side and made everyday tasks and navigating landscapes challenging in ways that you wouldn't think. It also affected my ability to manage fatigue and communicate due to aphasia, a language disorder that makes both speaking and understanding language difficult. Needless to say that school became a very different experience for me after this, where my needs, wants, and what I was trying to communicate often went misunderstood. I began my journey of advocacy in my first year back at mainstream school. I quickly learned that being the only student with a physical, neurodiverse background meant that I had to advocate for myself. I also learnt how hard it is to be something that you can't see.
Thanks so much, Hayley. We might pass to Matt. Matt, you introduced yourself beautifully yesterday to many of the group, but you might need to do so again because we've got a lot of new people too.
Yeah, no worries. Hello, I'm Matt. I'm an associate professor in learning intervention, and that's our inclusive education team. I've got some friendly faces from my team here today. I do know a lot of people in the crowd, which is wonderful. It's really nice to see some familiar, friendly faces. My background is I'm a teacher, so I work with 8 to 15-year-olds typically. And what's really interesting in my space is I started off very early in my career supporting kids from a whole range of different backgrounds, and became really, really passionate around the idea of social inclusion. And that's, of course, academic learning is really important, but it's the idea of how we can bring people together. And as I transitioned from being a school teacher into higher education, because of my interest in research, particularly in autism and ADHD, and I'm neurodivergent myself, I'm an ADHDer, I was really interested in the ideas of social inclusion in universities. And I have some close autistic friends and colleagues at the university, and they're really struggling with the physical environment and the culture around the physical environment. So we co-designed a low impact sensory space, and we had a big launch. And it's early on, you think, oh great, we've got a low impact sensory room now, this is going to solve all our problems, this is great. And what happened was we had the big opening, and had a staff member say to me, someone who wasn't publicly out as being autistic, they said to me afterwards, oh great, now there's one room that's not actively hostile to my needs, that's fantastic. And that stuck with me and then they apologised afterwards. I said, no, it's fine. It stuck with me for 2 reasons, and it really, really stuck with me. The first was, yes, it's a good point. Most of this space is not designed with that variability of need in mind. And the second thing was she thought she had to apologise for making any sort of comment about the norm not being good enough for her to be able to thrive. And I that really made me sad, because if we don't have those feedback loops, and so I'm lucky enough that I work with the wonderful Dr. Sarah Timperley, who you may have heard speak yesterday, and Dr. Jess Reardon, and we are co-leading the University of Melbourne Neurodiversity Project that seeks to improve the experiences of neurodivergent students, neurodivergent staff. But what we also think, and I think this is, I think it's so true what you said before earlier around nothing about us without us. What another phrase that I love is the fact that what is essential for some is often harmful for none. So the idea that a lot of these changes, and Sarah's research actually reflects this, are things that everyone wants. Just we have a name around accommodations or adjustments, but these are actually these things, these physical environment changes that actually help a lot of people. We just don't ever think that we need these things, or we don't think we're entitled to these things. And so that has become my real area of passion. And that's why I'm here today, is that journey about trying to make physical spaces, yes, more inclusive around higher education, but also changing the culture around how we have these conversations. I think that is something that will, it's the next 29 years of my career, Ben, I think. I've got a 29-year mortgage, so I've got a plan.
Sounds like you've got a date for retirement in mind too. Audrey, do you want to share some of your experiences?
Sure, happily. Excuse you can't hear me properly. I was at the Heads Together camp all weekend and I'm losing my voice. So hi, I'm Audrey. I'm 19 years old and I live with an acquired brain injury. My acquired brain injury was caused because of a treatment of a rare brain tumour when I was 5. Today, I'm not here as a designer or an educator, but as someone who has lived inside the impact of portal space design. For people like me, space isn't just design or a layout. It's the difference between making it through the day and going home at recess. Let me be blunt. Most schools aren't built for people like me in mind. In prep, I left school in week 5 for surgery and treatment and returned multiple months later. I was heavily fatigued, non-sensory available, and incredibly overwhelmed. There was nowhere to go, no space to rest, and no place to quietly recharge. Even though my primary school had just built a brand new library, it was always locked at lunchtime. So where did I go? Nowhere. I leave school early or sit alone, too exhausted to learn or connect. Later, in my second year at primary school, 6 times the size, I found it easier to find a space to sit that was bigger. I did sit a lot in stairwells, but often found my way into the deputy principal's office, where I worked hard on that friendship. The office wasn't designed as a sensory recovery area, but it became one because nothing else existed, and she was kind enough to fill the gaps. This happened again and again. If I needed a safe space, I had to build a personal relationship with someone senior enough to bend the rules for me. At every school, include only work because individual carries the loads, not because the environment was designed to support me. That was a big ask for the wrong person. Teachers and leaders already have enough to carry. And it means if I didn't make those connections early, I had nowhere to go. That's a failure on the system and for the space design. In high school, things were better, but only just. The crowds, the echoing hallways, the heat, and with the exhaustion. In year 7, I would hide underneath the table next to my locker, as I was nervous about going anywhere else, and I couldn't go anywhere else anyway. The library was an option, but again, really noisy with lots of people. And on hot and wet cold days, it was too overwhelming. Eventually, I negotiated my way to sitting in classrooms at lunch. Again, not because these spaces were built as a recovery, but because I had to make the connections to ask. Places that were inclusive were the wellbeing garden, fish pond, grass, picnic rugs, quietness. It worked because it was a calm and open place. It was both pretty and functional. In Year 7, I was not brave enough to go there. Design spaces for this age, as transformation is hard. What I'd like to leave you with: space is not natural. It's neither inclusive or exclusive. People like me need low STEM environments to function, quiet zones, rest spots, with space with light, air and softness. Inclusion shouldn't depend on how well students adapt, or whether the deputy principal has Lego in her office. If your design doesn't allow for downtime, it's not inclusive, it's exclusive. Ask yourself, where does a fatigued student go at recess? Where they can't lay without being watched, judged, or looked at. If you don't design the answer, they'll find one. And it might be the nearest stairwell, or worse, the bathrooms. If you have the power to make schools more than a place to teach, they can be a place that holds people. Design for the students who hide under tables, because space had worked better for me. I might have spent less trying to cope and more time trying to learn. Thank you.
Audrey, thanks for those wonderful words and sharing your experience. I think, as you could see, people found that to be quite a powerful moment. Judy, now looking at this at a system level, Audrey's experience is not unique.
Yes, microphone. Yes, that's exactly right. I'm going to try to juggle my notes, the microphone and the clicker, because I've put together a few slides. Just to think about who are we supporting in our education institutions. In school education, 1 in 5 students currently is identified by their teachers as a student with disability. And this is 2024 data. I know that in 2025, we're edging up closer to 29%. So that's a significant proportion of the students in our schools. When we think about the policy context and what's happening, we've had a Royal Commission into the abuse of people with disability. They handed down 222 recommendations in 12 volumes. That's led to a whole range of national initiatives, including a review of the Disability Discrimination Act, which hasn't been revised since 1992. And when you look at the language, it's deficit language and it really needs further consideration. One of the things they're introducing is this notion of a positive duty. And people might be familiar with positive duty with regards to the Sex Discrimination Act that was introduced in 2022. People are really aware now about gender-balanced panels, about thinking about how gender-inclusive workplaces are. This positive duty will make it a requirement for all duty holders to actually think about inclusion before they actually are faced with a complaint. And the notion was that people are bringing forward saying, these things aren't working for me. We actually need to do that thinking, as everyone on the panel's already mentioned, before we start designing spaces and places. So lots of initiatives in the national arena. It's also introduced this notion of equity instead of equality. Equality, everybody gets the same thing, and they're thinking, well, we all get the same, that's okay. And it's actually not. We're really moving into an arena where we think about equity, people getting what they actually need to thrive. And as the girl said, not just survive in the environment. We need all of our kids in schools to be flourishing. So we are also thinking about, I know we're specifically talking about disability today, but we're also talking about intersectionality. So diversity doesn't just exist as an isolated factor. We have cultural diversity, we have gender diversity, we have a whole range of disabilities that impact people in different ways. And they're not isolated from each other. You could have a person who is from a culturally diverse background, who has autism, is highly able and transgender. We need to think about intersectionality that will change the experience and the way people experience their environments. We're also thinking about pedagogy and how pedagogy impacts students. In the very colourful, oops, I just pushed that the wrong way, very colourful photo here, we used to have immersion as a key pedagogical approach where students had to be, their work had to be displayed, they were immersed in environments, and we quickly realised that this is overwhelming for students who have sensory stimulus issues. And we're starting to think about environments where only the things we need are actually out, so that there's an order, a tidiness to the environment. Pedagogical approaches at the moment are starting to lean towards science of learning and direct instruction, where you have a teacher standing usually in front of a whiteboard and students facing the front of the classroom. And in some schools, that's in rows. They're going back to rows. How then are we going to provide students with spaces to calm or self-regulate? And we've already heard about the importance of that. This is an area that a teacher just built in her own classroom to provide students with a space. We need to be doing that in the design and the building processes, as Audrey's already talked about. What about outside? Are they feeling safe outside? We're seeing teepees and little cubby houses, spots where students can perhaps retreat in outside areas. And they're doing that sometimes during the day, not just during play and lunchtime. School playgrounds are often chaotic. They're noisy, you're dodging balls that might come flying at you, and those unpredictable spaces cause undue stress for some people. We need to think about them still having access to the outdoor spaces, if that's what they want to do, at times that suit them, with appropriate facilities for them. We need to think about kids who need to keep moving while they're learning. The desk on the right there has got pedals on the bottom of it, so the student can actually pedal with their feet while they're sitting at the desk. So we need to think about furniture and IT. In the photo up there on the right, that's in an auditorium with hundreds of people in it, but each of the people listening to the presentation has a headset on, the presenter's got a microphone, and they are engaged in a presentation despite the fact that there are lots of people around. Technology is moving very, very quickly. How are we planning and designing spaces for inclusive technologies that might be able to assist us? So we need to think about, as everyone said, designing learning spaces but bringing diverse people to the table so that they can tell us how they want to interact with the environments and the spaces. And that needs to be a whole range of people, not just consult with one person who has a disability. Think about intersectionality and broad representation in that process.
Wonderful, thanks, Judy. Finn, we might pop the Slido up because we've given everyone a chance to sort of say some opening remarks, and the idea now will be to sort of engage in a little bit of Q&A. So we might put that up if we can. Oh, here he is, running from the back. We might have caught him by surprise. We actually have a few people who obviously had logged on a little bit earlier, so we do have a few questions ready and waiting to go. I'll relay this first question, but if you'd also like to pop your hand up, and Simon or Carolina can come with the microphone, and please try and direct your questions as you wish. One of the questions here is, when working with under 18s, how do you create spaces for downtime and quiet whilst also ensuring supervision and child-safe standards? So I guess, the idea of retreat, but, who's keeping an eye on those children? Kate, do you want to tackle that one to start with?
Sure, it's an easy one to start with.
Okay.
I think that it always comes down to flexibility. I think every learning environment's got to have options, and then the people that are using that environment, the teachers, the students, can sort of engage with that environment to create an option that works for them. I think at Heads Together we run big family camps, and we just had one last weekend. Both these amazing women were there. But that's something that we deal with a lot. And I think in terms of the safeguarding situation, it's really complicated. And yet what we tend to do, and I think something that you could do in that built environment, is making sure that it's visible. So, whether it's having a sort of quiet space, but that is actually visible from other spaces, that means that there's not as much concern about having support in there, and also not as much concern about not having support in there. But I think more than anything, it really is about, as Judy talked about, having all of those flexible spaces that students can kind of create for themselves. And rather than taking them away, and, as Audrey was talking about, spending so much time in the Deputy Principal's office, which is not a rare story at all, where you really are missing out on actually being part of that learning community. So that's my thought, flexibility.
Hayley or Audrey, just casting yourselves back to your school days, in terms of, a sense of safety and being, under supervision. Like, can you comment on those issues about, having a place to be aside, but also your sense of, being under the watchful eye of people who care about your well-being?
I'll go first because I graduated last year, so it's a bit more recent. I guess whenever I needed a break, I'd go up to the library after a couple of years, and there were constantly people walking around the library, the librarians, and I felt safe up there because it was like I could sit in the corner, sit at a desk, do what I want, and I knew I was fine. My teachers, if I popped out of the room, they were like, yep, she's probably going to have a break. But I found, as I said before, I found ways to make a quiet space, even if it was sticking my blazer over my head in the classroom and going to sleep. But I made it work.
Do we have any questions from the audience just yet? Not yet. No raised hands. We'll come back. All right, we'll keep looking through some of these other questions here. Should we have different inclusive frameworks for various physical learning environments like schools or museums, or follow the same basic principles? Matt, do you want to try and tackle that one?
Yeah. We can share a microphone. That's great. I think it's such an interesting question because I think everyone has made the same point, that it starts with that co-design lens, because you don't know what you don't know. And I can say that as an ADHDer, I have one set of needs, but I talk to someone else who has the exact same label as I do, and they will have a different perspective on that. And it comes back to, I think Judy was saying about intersectionality. For example, I share an office with Sarah, who many of you heard speak yesterday, and we on paper would look very similar, but in actual, our needs are very different. And so it's finding out how you put in place frameworks where you centre voice, and not just one voice and say, well, I've spoken to Matt, so that's all the ADHDers. It's how we canvass lots of different voices and how we create frameworks or ways of thinking that at all stages of that design process are checking in, coming back, checking in. And I know there's so many people doing such wonderful work in this space here in this room, but it starts, rather than having that one size fits all, often those assumptions will be challenged. I'll design something and think, this is the best thing ever. And then I'll ask someone like Audrey, and you say, oh, that's terrible, Matt. And I'll be like, right, that's really important. Why is it terrible? And that's so important to understand at that different point, that things, and making people feel safe to give that feedback, that things are always changeable. In terms of saying that, hey, even if I've designed something, spend more time on this, come back to me and tell me if there's any problems here, because I want it to actually have the desired impact. And that word impact is what we're all after in our work, whether architects, teachers, advocates, whatever we do.
Thanks, Matt. Now clearly, we've got thousands of existing schools, and so if we're talking about creating environments for students, obviously we've got university campuses that have, heritage buildings. We've got a lot of new early learning centres being built around the country, but we've got, again, hundreds, if not thousands, of existing ones as well. One of the things we talked about when we sort of convened the panel was, how can we respond through the existing infrastructure we've got in non-ad hoc ways that will address, the issues. And one of the questions here talks about, what are some strategies for negotiating competing needs, which, Matt, you've mentioned here, e.g. a love of natural light, but others I live with and have worked with even darker, dimmed lighting. How do we respond to this sort of gamut of needs when we're thinking about, modifying our existing infrastructure across our learning spaces? Kate?
So, yep. I think one of the things that's important when you have all of these competing needs is to remember that you've got to look at the entirety of the school and the entirety of the student's experience. So, yes, there may be some environments that are going to, suck, but then there might also be options that are exactly what that student needs. And the key really is that that student gets to lead the process of how they engage with that environment. And I think, that's where, all of us are so invested in this idea of the built space is incredibly important, but it's the culture and the practices and the attitudes that are even more important. I've seen time and time again schools with fandangled, fabulous designs, and they're not being used in an inclusive way at all. So I think that's kind of how you manage those competing needs is you just engage with the student and think about the whole picture.
I'm perhaps going to paraphrase a couple of the questions that are coming up here too. Judy, we've been talking about, and you've raised it yourself, the issues of, different pedagogical approaches. We might call it a return to direct instruction that's happening at the moment, as advocated by some of the big education systems. How do we cope with some of these changes in philosophy, or at least practice, in our built environments, while also trying to accommodate to a wide variety of needs?
I think that we need to think about flexibility of spaces. And so really in the current context, the furnishings have changed a little bit, but not much else has really changed. It's just the pedagogical approach that's changed. And thankfully, we've moved away from overstimulating environments where every piece of work every child ever did has to be on display, even if it's hanging from the ceiling in line of vision. Those core principles, I think, will apply, and we think about temperature, lighting, those inclusive elements of building design. And then the rest of it's really how we use the space more broadly, how we furnish the space, how we create spaces within spaces. One of the slides I had up showed how a teacher created a small quiet space inside her classroom for a student to retreat to. So I think it's possible to do that as long as we consult with the people using the spaces, understand what their needs are, and then think about flexibility in how we manage that.
Matt, there's several questions about online environments, and I think you're the man to answer them. You've written several books about online experiences, both social and learning. Can you comment about, the inclusion in online spaces and how that might relate to physical spaces as well?
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. I'm sure other people here would be able to please jump in if you have something to say as well. So I'm very lucky. I wear a couple of different hats, and one is I work with some amazing people, including Jess Rawlings. I think some people here do know. Jess is the first female openly autistic CEO of a University of Melbourne spin-out. And we set up a social enterprise called Next Level Collaboration. And the problem we were seeking to solve was really around social connection and safe online gaming. And we have a program we've been running where it's called Safe Play, where we use commercially developed games, but we create safe whitelist servers where we can verify everyone's identity. And as part of our social mission, we know there's a chronic underemployment of neurodivergent young adults, teens and young adults. So they hit 16, 17, 18. And we know a lot of workplaces don't have working environments where they'll, A, get paid a decent amount for their time, a fair amount for their time. They won't have employers that will understand some of the differences of neurodivergence. So we want to employ these young adults to run Safe Play. So we've been running this now, we've been running Next Level Collaboration for 5 years as an in-person program. We set up Safe Play and just launched it this year. And the idea is it's gaming communities where it's a bit like the swimming pool. Rather than the wild oceans of the online world, we have lifeguards on duty. But there's more than just watching over and making sure that these are safe environments. It's about how we support people to develop self-advocacy skills, how we build from strengths and interests, how we show our young people that they too have value in this world, because they get so much messaging that their interests aren't valid. And I just think I'm a very small part of this. The people who I work with are doing an amazing job of transforming lives. A lot of the kids we work with are school can't, or school, I don't like the word refusal. They're really, the school system is not meeting their needs, so they're not going to school. And so this, for them, is often a lifeline to community. So I think it's not my work, I should say, of Jess Rawlings and some of my other colleagues who do this, but it is transformative work. And it is the sort of spaces, I don't know whether you've had experiences of online spaces that you've found to be safe spaces, but for a lot of our young kids, this is where friendships and safety occurs.
Are there any great questions that people want to ask in the audience? We've got lots and lots of questions on Slido. Yes? We did this yesterday too.
So, I have a question about what's easy and what's right. So, as a PhD student, I have a lot of work to do, and the way I access my PC, my computer is different. I use my feet because I cannot use my hands very effectively. So I use my feet and use toes to type. When I do that, I'm slow. I'm much slower than a typical person doing the typing stuff. So I consulted the DSS, and they said I could have a support worker to move the data from A to B, for example, but still I have to do all the typing myself. So I was wondering if you have seen the similar issues in the code design process. How do you differentiate wants and needs?
Can you phrase the last bit just one more time?
How do you differentiate? How do you tell the difference between wants and needs?
How do you tell the difference between wants and needs? Yeah.
That was such a great question. And I also love the way you started it with the difference between what's easy and what's right. And I think the only way, well, first of all, understanding that wants and needs are two different things, very important. Listening to wants and needs, very important. And I think something that I keep thinking about as we're talking here is respect. And I think that that's where your whole argument about what's right versus what's easy is just so important to this whole entire process, because, you know, even when you were speaking, Matt, about the student being sort of embarrassed to say, I just think that, you know, all of you guys out there you can't be too scared to engage, you know, with people's wants and needs. And your job is not to decide what's easy or what's right. Your job is to really work through that with the person who's in that space. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I really I loved hearing what you had to say.
I might just jump in there too, because I think if a need is a requirement, if I'm going to engage in an activity or with a space or whatever it is that I'm engaging with another person, what do I need in order to be able to engage then becomes a requirement or a need. Other things are perhaps nice to have, things that I might want, but there's a requirement that from an equity perspective that we have what we need to be able to engage.
Speaking from like my personal experience in growing up and with a physical disability in a school setting, and that at the end of the day, I've noticed that there isn't really too much of a difference between a want and a need. It's important to have them addressed regardless. Because for me personally, trying to engage with my peers in the playground, it was hard for me, but it was doable. And it was either learn to adapt to the setting or segregate myself. And at the end of the day, I found the reason why I say that they're both as important as each other is because the fact years down the road, and I know that this is something that Matt discussed earlier, the mental health impacts that it has on you, and the level of kind of sort of underlying shame that you carry in regards to your disability and needing to speak up for yourself, it is very much present. So I personally find that they're just as important as each other and they need to be addressed.
Building off what Hallie said, I think it's such interesting is my wants become needs throughout the day, as speaking personally. My meds wear off. I'm on some pretty some pretty fun meds that mean that in the morning it's long acting. I can get by without things. In the afternoon, I've started to actively say, actually, I really need, watching the video, I really need the captions on just so I'm processing what's been said. I really need to take this meeting somewhere else because our offices are built like Apple shops with glass. And I think Judy made the comment. And so like, yeah, there's someone who brings their dog, which is great in the morning when I'm regulated. But in the afternoon, you've got a caboodle running around your floor. I'm like, I'm trying to look at a spreadsheet with other people right now. And I am seeing dog. And I'm sure there's probably a lot of ADHDs in this crowd who probably relate to that. And things change. That's the whole thing. And I think that's Haley's point. It's so powerful. I thought is that, sometimes I'm not sure which is which, personally.
Simon, if you wouldn't mind.
Microphone off. Simon, if you wouldn't mind just jumping over to Jody there. While we're waiting for Jody's question, I might just fire one more in the middle. There's a couple of questions here, again, paraphrasing about, I guess the role of educators, whatever the setting may be, whatever education sector, but the role of the educators, and Kate, you mentioned this, in really, taking up, the mantle and ensuring that some of these things are actually happening. And I guess the question is, how do we work with people in education to realise that there are wants and needs and to respond appropriately? How do we bring everyone on board?
Well, I think that teachers are under an enormous amount of pressure. I think, as you mentioned, the stats of how many students they're supporting with additional needs are pretty staggering. So we give them more support, and we give them more time and stop expecting them to fit 10 million things in their day. Because, I think that And I think we provide, like anything, we provide good leadership. Like if a school has good leadership, they are going to prioritise inclusion. They are going to prioritise their staff having adequate time to understand what the wants and needs of their students are, because it takes time. And I think that it also takes, and this is where I hope that we can all work together on this, it takes consistency. We've got to have more consistency of approaches, because you certainly, in my experience, I've got the chance to work in, 100 different schools, and they're all a completely different universe to each other. And I think that, we still don't understand inclusion. I think we talk about it a lot and we say it a lot, and I hope Christine Imms is talking at some point today, because, the way that Christine explains participation and accessibility, like if every school and teacher understood just that, it'd be a game changer.
Well, she will be speaking, and so we'll all be listening. Judy, quickly, now you're trying to really implement a lot of what we're talking about at a system level. Can you say a few words about working with staff?
Yeah, I think the conversation's really important. I think we need to be having conversations about this all day, every day. I think leadership is really important. Ben mentioned in the introduction that we've been involved in some research projects together, and we've seen on-site in schools how important leadership is, from one school that we walked into where leadership actually didn't understand. They just hadn't even thought about affordances of spaces or the people who were using those spaces. And it was a stark contrast to a principal in another school, brand new school, who said to his staff, I just want to make sure that every student feels welcomed, valued in this environment, and then we'll worry about literacy and numeracy later. He had a completely different way of approaching his school leadership. And it really made us stop and reflect, and we've talked about this ad nauseum, I think, is that we expect principals to already know all of this and know how to do it, and we don't actually have enough focus on conversations and bringing everybody in the education community along this journey. So I think we need to make time and space to have education, but not in terms of sit down and do this course online, let's look at the disability standards for education online learning modules, but have conversations so that we continue to grow our understandings and our experiences, because we're limited in our knowledge, and we're all learning on an ongoing basis.
I also think that like representation is really important as well. Like if you don't have anyone on your school board that has any form of disability, it's like they don't so much have a seat at the table, and they're not in the forefront of your mind in any of those meetings. And I generally find that schools that don't have someone on their board with a disability really miss the mark on accessibility and the need for it.
Jody, no, she is the keynote speaker in 5 minutes, so she might have something to say then. Yeah? All right. Look, I think we have other questions, but I want to invite Magna to join us for a few minutes. And we did talk about this, so we're not putting her quite on the spot, but she didn't know quite what the panel was going to say. But the brief was, and maybe you can take my seat, Magna, if you'd like. The brief was, can you listen to what's been said? Magna has vast experience, and you'll hear all about that later today. You're working, in the Middle East, working in the United States, working in other North American countries, Canada, where she's also from, and working in Europe. And what has been said this morning resonates with what you hear in other parts of the world.
Thank you, Ben. It was so wonderful listening to the expertise on this morning's panel, so thank you all. So I just want to reflect very quickly to what I've learned from each of you and maybe reflect on the cultural context that Ben has asked me to think about. So I think it was really important, Kate and Julie, what you shared about the importance of voice and consultation and conversation. But I think we say this in almost a tokenistic way at times, and it's not really authentic. So I think that's so important. And also where it sits in the process, that it should follow throughout the process. I thought that was very useful, what you shared. And also, Julie, your point on intersectionality, I think it's so important. Outside of this room, people think of disability as this monolithic thing. And all of us know when people talk to me and say, oh, you work in disability design, I say, no, I don't. Actually, I only know about neurodiversity and autism. You'll have to ask another expert about the other forms of disability because I don't know, and I don't have the expertise in all of it. So to understand intersectionality and the distinction across the spectrum is so important. And Haley and Audrey, your expert opinions on the effects of how we design our spaces, and then leave it up to you to navigate them, and throw that responsibility to you as an individual as opposed to us as the designers of that. I think it's shameful of the design environment to put that responsibility on a person when we do make design decisions for all sorts of ridiculous reasons, of ego, of spectacle, of money, and we don't make decisions to make someone's life less fatigued. So as you said, Audrey, so eloquently, that you could learn more if you didn't have to cope as much with the environment. That, to me, is much more important than to have a beautiful, sexy, award-winning, Instagrammable project. And Matt, the point of the right to ask for something, and I think, Haley, you made an excellent point about, to you, there is no distinction between wants and needs. And I think that's really important. And in the work that I've done, one of the moments that sat with me a lot was giving a keynote back-to-back with a pair of amazing women, Georgia Harper and Sam Ayrn, both autistic women in the UK, who have amazing, very successful careers as lobbyists of the UK government to get policy put in place specifically for autistic women. And these are women who understand the legislative policy, rights, codes, landscape. And they came on for their keynote after mine and I had talked about designing for autism, and they walked up to me and they said, it had never occurred to us probably the most qualified women around autism advocacy and supports in the United Kingdom. They said it had never occurred to us that we could ask for design changes. We just assumed that it was our autism's fault, that we couldn't cope with these buildings that we're thrown into. And it had never, like you said, they were apologetic in asking for these things. And I think that's a huge problem, and it speaks to what Haley said about wants and needs and privilege. So what Haley may want and need, someone else will demand when they're on the other spectrum of privilege. So imagine you walk into, I don't know, a first-class business class lounge somewhere in an airport, and in walks a fancy, affluent, white male individual, and they don't find the brand of coffee that they like. Suddenly that becomes a demand, and they feel perfectly comfortable demanding it, and they're very belligerent about it, and it's such an insignificant need. And then you see a community that has what people label as, oh, this is a luxury. We don't have the money to do these things, but it's a support that will allow you to learn, to be more productive, to be healthier, happier in your spaces. So just listening this morning, it got me to thinking about, they kept on growing, this long list, of 5 C's. So the first is around cost. So Ben asked me to think what needs to change. I think the design community needs to change the way we think about cost, because it becomes so many times the excuse for not doing what's right, to your point, the right thing to do because it's going to cost us too much. And I think we need to reframe cost to your point around consultation. There's expertise on this panel. When we engage with individuals with lived experience, that is the most important expertise in the rooms, and we don't pay them. And we pay the consultants that come in with an ignorance of this lived experience far more than we would ever consider paying the person that actually has the expertise to solve the problem. And we have to change that. That's built into our contracts. Clients need to understand it. It's not a service for free. It's a lifetime of expertise that they are giving for free to architects, designers, consultants, interior designers. As wonderful as they are learning from them and then taking it and charging a fee to design with that knowledge. And we offer them lunch. It's shameful, honestly, because that is the true expertise that we're learning from as designers. And another thing about cost, I always tell my clients, it is less expensive to design a more expensive building if it's designed right, because the costs you will save downstream of those decisions in allowing a student to spend more time learning than coping. She'll move through the curriculum faster, she'll spend more time, she'll be happier, healthier. To Haley's point about the mental health burdens that come when your needs are not being met, that costs us money too. You would think that people would do it because of the human value, but unfortunately not. So if you can make the business case and the financial argument of what you save by paying more upfront, whether it's for expertise consultant from lived experience or whether it's for investing in that infrastructure of space that Haley and Audrey shared about during their day moving and navigating. They need an infrastructure space that costs us money to build. Those are the arguments we need to start making. And whenever a client asks me how much is it going to cost me to do X, I tell them, how much is it going to cost you not to do X? Because you will pay for it at some point and it will cost you more not to do it right up front. So cost is really important. The other point is culture. So Ben asked me to think about reflect like globally. I work a lot across a whole bunch of cultures, and maybe we need to dedicate a whole symposium about this, because in different cultures and different contexts, and I was talking yesterday, some wonderful young woman, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, pointed out the national insurance disability, what was it? This local insurance scheme, this economic scheme that you've come up with, that when it was put in place in Australia, suddenly unlocked all these services and accommodations. So that's a cultural shift. I work in all sorts of different countries where the responsibility for disability falls under all sorts of different siloed things. So you have Ministry of Education, Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Public Works. So it's all fragmented. And it's so hard to get something done when those are fragments, because the responsibility becomes diluted, the budgets and the costs are not connected, and the decision-making is a problem. But I think the most, and I could talk about like stigma and gender and all sorts of other things around culture, but I think the most important thing is language. we don't agree on what we mean when we say things in the world of designing for accommodation. Even the word inclusion, accessibility, we don't all agree what it means. But I'll give you one example. I was brought in to help design what they called a hospital in a Middle Eastern country. And then as I was developing the programming and the brief, working with the stakeholders and engaging them, I realized this is all educational services that you're providing, but they were very much entrenched in the medical model and were presenting it as a hospital. The Ministry of Health was paying for it, so we had to call it a hospital. We had to call the children that were coming into the space patients. And I thought that was very destructive because it wasn't a supportive environment and it was keeping us in the medicalized model. So when we would design a room, they would call it therapy. That very same room in a school environment may be called support. That very same room in a workplace environment may be called accommodation. That very same room in a higher education or in a cityscape is just space that's there to support everyone. And it's the same thing. So we don't agree on language, and that can be very difficult navigating because people will be talking about things in different ways. And I'll talk a little bit more about language this afternoon. The other C is conversation. And we talked about that a lot, making sure people are heard, but also heard throughout the process and then heard after the process. I think the biggest problem with consultation is it doesn't happen long enough. And it ends at the end of a project and we never go back and ask the people, so you said this when we first began and we ended up doing this and now you're living it, so how's it working out? We never ask that last question, never. Very, very rarely. Clients are afraid we spend millions of dollars, we don't want to go back in and learn that we made a mistake. And then they go around and build another one, making the same mistake because they didn't ask one question to the same people who offered their expertise. So I think conversations, and I like the word consultation so much better because it's professional, because I can charge for a consultation and I can get a fee to pay the experts that are bringing the lived experience, but I would say it's a conversation, how am I charging a client for a conversation? So I love the word consultation, thank you, I think that's really helpful. Criticality. There are real critical issues in the worlds that we're building in 3 typologies that I think we need to think about. Healthcare, workplace, and our cities, because cities are really important. We can create very inclusive islands that are completely accessible and beautiful places that we aspire to, but without the cities and the fabric that stitches together, they're just islands in a sea of inaccessibility. You can't get from one thing to another. So we really have to think about those 3 levels. Healthcare, I don't know what it's like in Australia, what the statistics are like in North America, where I've designed some hospitals. The healthcare statistics are shocking with the autistic adult community, particularly those that are responsible for managing their own care, independent adults, that the myth is they may be quote unquote high functioning and able, but they may actually have more vulnerability and more need because of that quote unquote label. So mortality rates are higher, lots of problems with delaying healthcare. I think I talked about this with someone yesterday, delaying care until it's too critical. And the final thing, the final C, is this idea is a solution. So I've talked about some problems. One of the solutions, I think, is curation and choice. I was talking to someone yesterday and we were talking about how can we standardize all of this, because you can, if you put it into code, if you make it required of architects, then it will get done. But I think the problem with standardization is that it becomes a one-size-fits-all, it's a single solution, people can tick it off a checklist and it's done. But you need to create this choice. So I always talk about the sensory curation of space. So it's not about just a very quiet space, it's not about just a very engaging space, it's about everything in between. And you have to curate that around people's experiences and what their wants and needs are throughout the day. So those are the 5 C's that I kind of gathered from this morning's conversation, just reflecting on some of our own work and other places in the world. I hope it was helpful.
Thanks so much for helping to tie all the threads together, Magda. I think also a prelude to your keynote later in the day. Can you please just join me again thanking Judy, Kate, Audrey, Hayley, and Matt?